In this video, I'm going to demonstrate hand sewing using a backstitch, which is a lot more secure than a running stitch. So to start with, we need to look at threading the needle. So we have our thread, and a hand sewing needle. Hand sewing needles have the eye in the end, not in the point like a sewing machine needle, and they come in different lengths and sizes. For most hand sewing projects, you'll need to use a fairly small needle because you don't want the holes in the fabric to be so big that your knot will go right through. So after you've threaded the needle, a lot of people starting out with hand sewing want to take the two tails of thread and even them up and tie them together and sew with a doubled thread like this. That would be fine if we were sewing on a button. Makes it nice and secure, but for hand sewing we only want to use single thread. Does make it a little more difficult as you're learning because you need to sort of pinch the end of the needle to prevent the thread from sliding all the way through, and you also have to keep an eye on where this shorter tail is so that as it gets close to the fabric you don't let it get caught. But single thread really is the appropriate way to do this. So I'm going to show you my preferred way of tying a knot. This way you don't have to keep trying to tie knots in the same spot over and over to get a large enough knot. It's messy but very effective and quick. So I take the thread and I wrap it a couple of times around my index finger, and then I twist it between my thumb and my index finger until I have this twisted clump of thread here. And then if you pinch the tail of the thread and just pull it through your fingers, you end up with a knot. Like I said, it's not necessarily pretty, but it will be hidden on the inside of your work, so it won't really matter, and definitely won't pop through the fabric behind your needle. So as I said before, a lot of people want to just use a running stitch when they hand sew, which is a sort of in and out stitch. And if you've done lacing cards or other little beginner sewing projects, especially as a kid, they probably used just a simple in and out running stitch. Okay, so it would look a little like this, probably closer stitches, probably neater, probably shorter, which is fine. But the point is, this is not the stitch we will use for our hand sewing projects. It's great for a temporary stitch. We also sometimes call this a basting stitch because it holds things together temporarily. But one of the flaws of a running stitch is if you pull the thread, you see it gathers up the fabric. That can actually be really helpful if we were trying to gather something or make pleats, but we're not. So, and you see how easily that came out. So if we broke the thread in one spot, it would come undone from the whole project. So that's why we don't want to use that running stitch. So instead, what we're going to use is called a backstitch. There are a couple of ways to do this, and obviously I'm going to be demonstrating right-handed because I am right-handed. Sometimes after you've already threaded the needle, if you have to re-thread it, you may have to re-trim your thread. If the end is frayed, it may not go through the needle as well. I'm using my fabric shears. If you watched the slides on tools, you know that shears are different from scissors, and scissors we use for paper, and these fabric shears we would never use on paper. We save them for fabric only because paper will dull them and then they won't work with our fabric. So I've got my needle all threaded. I want the knot to be on the long tail, and then the free end is shorter, see? If I had needed to, I could have used a needle threader. To use a needle threader, the wire loop gets poked through the eye of the needle. So you put the wire through the eye of the needle, you've got the loop on the wire, and it's generally easier to put the thread through that, obviously with a much bigger opening, than the eye of the needle itself. So once the thread is through the wire loop, you can pull the threader back out and threads the needle for you. So whichever way you want to get your needle threaded, it doesn't matter, as long as you have your short tail with no knot, your long tail with a knot, and your needle's threaded. So we have a practice piece of fabric here. I really like to use a plaid or striped fabric to practice hand sewing because it gives you some nice straight lines woven or printed right into the fabric to follow so that you can practice keeping your stitches straight. If you don't have fabric with a straight design, you can take any piece of fabric and just mark a straight line with a marking pencil, tailor's chalk. On our seam gauge, I'm gonna set this for 1/4 of an inch. So you see here we have 1 inch, so the dot's at half. So we're just gonna raise this little slider up just a bit, and so the distance from point to point here is 1/4 of an inch, and this is about the length we want our stitches to be so that they're secure but not so small that it's going to take forever or be basically one big knot, especially if a mistake is made. So either method, we're going to start by coming up through the back of the fabric along a line, and we're going to make our first stitch. So we're putting the needle into the fabric about 1/4 of an inch from where it came out. So that's the first stitch. For the second stitch, you're going to come up in the middle of your first stitch, right underneath it, right in the middle. And this is why we call it a back stitch, because we went backward to start our next stitch. So now our thread is coming up in the middle of the stitch. We're going to do another 1/4 of an inch, so that puts us just a little bit past the end of the first stitch. And when we come up again, the middle of our second stitch is also the end of the first stitch. And we just continue like that, making 1/4 of an inch stitches, each one starting back halfway from the stitch that we did previously. And you're just going to keep on practicing like this. You want to check every now and then to make sure your stitches are still about 1/4 of an inch, that they haven't started running shorter or longer. And I know my stitches aren't landing right on top of each other. This is 2 reasons. One, I'm sort of trying to make it so you can kind of see where they're landing. If they were right on top of each other, it's harder to see that. But also, kind of looking at this through the camera, which is a little bit disorienting compared to looking at it straight on. Okay, so after you've done a few inches of practice so that you know you're doing the right sequence, and we have overlapping 1/4 inch stitches on the front, in the back they pretty much touch each other. When we're ready to tie a knot, either because we're running out of thread or because we've gotten to the end of the fabric or whatever, when you need to tie your knot, you're going to put your needle underneath one of your last stitches that you've done. And as you're pulling the thread, and this is why we don't want too long of a piece of thread, the longer the thread, the more likely it gets tangled and you end up with a knot in your work that you want to try to take out after. Always a pain. So we go back through this loop that we just made, and if we do that a couple of times right in the same place, making a loop and going through the loop, then we'll have a knot there. Alright, so that is one backstitch method. The other just kind of makes the stitches in a slightly different order. Instead of starting the stitch back, you end the stitch back. So I'm going to show you that. So to start with, same thing, come up somewhere in your fabric where your stitches are going to be. Okay. And we're going to make a 1/4 of an inch stitch. And then this time we're going to come forward just about 1/8 of an inch, so half a stitch, and then we're going to go into the end of that first stitch to go back down, and then again we'll go about 1/4 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch past the end of this stitch, which is about 1/4 of an inch past here where we're starting, and then go back to the end and start our next stitch and go back, oops, and start our next stitch and go back. And essentially what we're doing here is making what ended up being what the back looked like with the other method, and you can see here now the back looks like the front did. So we're just doing the opposite instead of starting in the middle and going slightly ahead, we're going slightly ahead, and then when we go backward, we're in the middle. So it's really the same stitch, just a preference in how it's comfortable for you to do it. And again, when we get to the end, go through the last stitch, go through the loop, and do that a couple of times in the same spot to secure our thread. There we go. Something else just to keep in mind as you're going along, let's say we're starting a stitch here. You can see double thread up until this short tail comes through right here. And you can see the tail is getting really close to where the thread's coming up through the fabric. So what we want to do is slide the needle along the thread a little more, and now you see we have some more slack between where the thread's coming through the fabric and the short tail, so that the short tail isn't getting caught up in our stitches and we're not starting to sew double.